The SEALs watched their captain walk into a burning mountain pass and never come back out. His last radio transmission lasted 11 seconds. 3 days later, his unit was filling out the paperwork to declare him dead, when a woman none of them recognized stepped out of the fog at the edge of the tree line, one arm wrapped around the missing captain's waist, holding him upright with the kind of grip that said she had carried heavier men over longer distances before. She was covered in blood that wasn't hers, wearing civilian clothes, and she hadn't slept in 72 hours. Nobody knew her name. Nobody knew where she'd come from. And nobody, not one person standing on that frozen Montana ridgeline, knew what she had just survived to bring him home. If this story has you hooked already, you're not alone. Subscribe to my channel and follow along to the very end, because this one is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Hit the like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The storm came in off the Bitterroot Range the way it always did in late November, fast, without ceremony, and with no interest in the plans of the people underneath it. By 6 in the evening, visibility along the service road outside Harlow Creek had dropped to less than 30 feet. The trees disappeared first, then the road markers, then the outline of the building itself, swallowed by horizontal snow until Blackridge Military Medical Center looked less like a hospital and more like a dim smear of light against a wall of white. Inside, the emergency floor was running at capacity. That wasn't unusual. Blackridge sat 40 minutes from Fort Callahan, one of the Army's primary cold weather training installations, and the winter months reliably delivered a steady rotation of frostbite cases, training injuries, and the occasional vehicle accident from soldiers who underestimated what ice did to a mountain road at night. The staff knew the rhythm of it. They moved through the floor without wasted motion, passing charts and supply carts and curtain bays, with the quiet efficiency of people who had long ago stopped being surprised by the things the military sent their way. Nurse Elara Voss was restocking the secondary trauma bay when she heard the argument begin. It wasn't an unusual sound on the floor either. The emergency unit ran on pressure, and pressure made people loud. But she recognized one of the voices before she even turned around, and that was enough to make her set down the supply tray and listen. The voice belonged to Sergeant Dale Pruitt, one of the training NCOs from Fort Callahan's Winter Warfare program. He was standing in the intake corridor with his arm wrapped around a younger soldier, a private named Owens, who was holding his left side with the careful rigidity of someone trying not to breathe too deeply. Pruitt was talking to the intake coordinator, a younger woman named Deanna, who looked like she was doing her level best to stay calm. "He took a hit from a training round," Pruitt was saying. "Close range. I know it's rubber, but something's not right. Kid's been getting worse for the last hour." "I understand," Deanna said. "I just need you to complete the intake form before I can route him to—" "The kid is struggling to breathe. You want me to fill out a form?" Elara was already moving. She crossed the corridor in 8 steps, took one look at Owens, the color of his face, the way his shoulder was riding slightly higher than the other, the shallow rhythm of his chest, and reached for the pulse oximeter clipped to the supply cart by the door. "When did the pain start?" she asked, pressing the sensor to Owens' fingertip without preamble. Owens looked at her. His voice came out thin. "During the afternoon exercise. Maybe 3 hours ago." "Did it get worse gradually or all at once?" "Gradually. Then all at once about 20 minutes back." The oximeter read 91%. She moved the sensor, checked his radial pulse, pressed 2 fingers lightly below his left clavicle. He winced. Not the dramatic flinch of someone performing pain, the small, involuntary tightening of someone who had been managing something real for hours and was starting to lose that battle. "He needs a chest film and a physician right now," Elara said to Deanna. "Possible pneumothorax. Don't route him to general intake." "You're not authorized to—" The voice came from behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Colonel Denton Graves, Blackridge's operations chief, had a voice that carried like a PA announcement, smooth, projecting, calibrated to fill a room. He used it the way some people used furniture, to establish who owned the space. Elara turned. He was standing in the doorway to the administrative corridor, arms folded across his chest, dressed in his uniform with the kind of crispness that suggested he had not spent the last 4 hours on his feet managing actual patients. He was a tall man, somewhere in his early 50s, with silver-edged hair and the flat, measuring look of someone who had spent years deciding what other people were worth. "The intake process exists for a reason," he said. He wasn't looking at Owens. He was looking at Elara. "You're not a physician. You don't root patients." "His O2 sat is 91 and dropping," Elara said. "He needs imaging. What he needs is to go through intake like everyone else, and what you need is to stop practicing medicine on my floor." Graves turned to Deanna. "Standard intake. Get the paperwork completed first." Sergeant Pruitt stared at him. "Are you serious right now?" "Sergeant, I'd suggest you let the medical professionals handle this." "With respect, sir, the nurse is the only professional here who's looked at him." Graves let the silence sit for exactly one beat. It was a practiced pause, the kind designed to remind everyone in the corridor who held rank. Then he looked at Elara. "Voss, off the floor." She held his gaze. "He's showing signs of, I didn't ask for your assessment. I gave you an instruction." Elara looked at Owens. His lips had a slight blue tinge that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. She looked at Deanna, who was staring at her clipboard like she wanted to disappear into it. She looked at Pruitt, who looked like a man deciding whether to say something that would end his career. Then she reached past Graves, picked up the phone on the intake desk, and called the attending physician on duty herself. The call lasted 45 seconds. By the time she hung up, Dr. Mira Fenton was already coming through the double doors from the physician's corridor, moving fast, reading the situation the way experienced emergency doctors do. Not from the chart, but from the faces of the people in the room. Owens was in a trauma bay within 3 minutes. The chest film confirmed what Elara had suspected, a small but developing pneumothorax, likely from a compression injury to the chest wall. Not immediately life-threatening, but on its way there. Graves waited until Fenton and the resident had the situation under control. Then he found Elara. She was back at the supply cart, writing her incident notes in the flat, precise shorthand she'd used for 15 years. She heard his footsteps stop behind her and kept writing. "I'm going to say this once," he said. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he didn't want an audience. "You went around me, on my floor, in front of a patient and 2 enlisted personnel. The patient needed a physician. The patient was going through intake. There's a process. The process was going to cost him a collapsed lung." Graves was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed, but something behind it had sharpened. "I've read your file, Voss. You came here from a civilian trauma program up in Forsyth. 12 years in hospital nursing, some stint in a field program I couldn't find any specifics on." A pause. "You don't have military rank. You don't have command authority. What you have is a nursing credential and a contract position, and both of those exist because I allow them to." She put down her pen, turned to face him. "I understand," she said. "Good." He straightened. "You're reassigned to 3rd floor post-op starting tomorrow. I want you off this floor by the end of the shift." She didn't blink. "Understood." He walked away. She stood by the supply cart for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she picked up her pen, finished her incident notes, signed them, and placed them in the correct folder. She walked to the staff locker room, changed out of her scrubs with the same unhurried precision she used for everything, pulled on her civilian jacket, and clipped her Blackridge badge to her front pocket. Then she stopped. She stood in front of her locker for a long moment, looking at the badge, at her name on it, at the photo that had been taken 11 months ago on her first week at the hospital, when she had looked at the camera with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to let what she knew show on her face. She unclipped the badge, set it on the shelf inside the locker, closed the locker door, and walked out. The storm had intensified by the time she crossed the parking lot. Snow was coming sideways now, driven by a wind that had found its edge somewhere over the Canadian border and hadn't softened since. Her truck was parked in the staff section at the far end of the lot. An old F-250, dark green, with more miles on it than she'd ever calculated, and a heater that worked when it felt like it. She climbed in, started the engine, and sat there while the cab slowly began to warm. Her phone sat in the cup holder. She didn't reach for it. Outside, the lights of Blackridge Military Medical Center were still visible through the snow. A building full of people who thought they knew what they were doing, running on processes and protocols and the authority of men like Denton Graves, who had never once had to make a decision in a place where the nearest backup was 3 hours away, and the patient in front of them was the only one they'd be able to save tonight. Elara had worked in those places, more than once. She put the truck in gear. She didn't drive home. The communications room at Fort Callahan's Emergency Coordination Center wasn't technically part of the hospital's operational structure, but Elara had spent enough time at the fort to know where it was and who ran it. The duty sergeant on shift that night was a man named Torres, who she'd treated for a sprained ankle 4 months ago and who owed her a favor he'd been trying to figure out how to repay. She walked in at 2140 hours, shaking snow off her jacket, and Torres looked up from his station with the expression of someone who had not expected to see a civilian nurse during a whiteout storm. "Voss, what are you doing here?" "I need to listen to something," she said. "Open frequencies from the Bitterroot sector, last 6 hours." Torres frowned. "That's restricted?" "I know it's restricted." A pause. Torres looked at her. Then he looked at his screens. Then he made the calculation that people sometimes make when they trust someone more than they trust the rule being used to stop her. "I didn't see you come in," he said. He stood up. "I need coffee. Take about 5 minutes." He walked out. Elara sat down. She found the Bitterroot sector frequencies in under 2 minutes. The recordings were time-stamped, and she worked backward from the most recent, her hands moving through the interface with the muscle memory of someone who had operated this equipment before. Not as a civilian nurse, not as a contract staffer at a military hospital, but as something else, in a version of herself she had spent 3 years trying to set aside. She found the first fragment at the 90-minute mark. It was a broken transmission, heavy with static, the voice cutting in and out over what sounded like sustained wind, and she leaned closer, possibly gunfire at distance. The voice was male, controlled, speaking in the compressed shorthand of someone trained to communicate under fire. "Extraction point is gone. Repeat, primary is gone. Bravo elements are moving north. I'm static. 7 seconds of nothing. Stay on the northern route. Do not, repeat, do not return for..." The transmission ended. She replayed it twice. Then she opened the next fragment, 12 minutes later. Same frequency, same voice, but rougher now. Something wet and effortful in the breathing underneath the words. Their moving patterns consistent with a contain and capture. Not pursuit. They're trying to... Static again. Then a final 3 words, barely intelligible, before the signal dropped entirely. She sat back. Contain and capture. Not pursuit. Not a retreating force hunting a target of opportunity. A deliberate, structured pattern. The kind you use when you want someone alive. She'd seen it before. She knew exactly what it looked like on the ground, and what it meant for the man on the other end of that radio. She printed the timestamps, folded the paper, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she walked to Colonel Graves' emergency contact number, the one posted on every coordination board in the fort, and she called it from the duty desk phone. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Graves?" "Colonel, it's Elara Voss. I've been reviewing the emergency transmissions from the Bitterroot sector operation tonight. How did you access those frequencies?" "That's not the relevant question right now. The transmission pattern from the missing officer suggests a contain and capture rather than a pursuit scenario. He may be alive. If there's a QRF being staged, they need to... Voss." His voice was flat and precise, the way someone sounds when they're not just irritated but have made a decision. "You were removed from the floor tonight. You don't have authorization to access military communications, and you certainly don't have the tactical background to analyze." "I have more tactical background than anyone in that hospital," she said. She hadn't meant to say it quite that directly, but the words came out clean, without apology. Silence. "You're a contract nurse," Graves said, "who has now violated secure communication protocols on top of everything else tonight. I want you off this post before I have to make this a formal matter." The line went dead. Elara stood holding the phone. She looked at the door. She looked at the printed timestamps in her jacket pocket. She thought about the voice in those recordings, the steadiness of it under fire, the deliberate information in what he'd said, the way a man sounds when he has accepted the situation he's in, but hasn't accepted that it ends there. She set the phone down. She walked to the window of the coordination room and looked out into the storm. The mountains were invisible. The Bitterroot Range was out there somewhere behind the snow and the dark. And somewhere in it, if she was right, there was a man sitting in whatever cover he'd found, bleeding probably, buying time with the assumption that the people behind the radios were listening. They weren't. She turned away from the window. The supply room at Fort Callahan's motor pool wasn't locked. It should have been, but the latch had been broken since September, and the work order to fix it had been lost somewhere in the post's administrative backlog. Elara had noticed the broken latch 3 months ago, the way she noticed most things. Not because she was looking for it, but because she was the kind of person who cataloged details without deciding to. She cataloged them the same way she cataloged the emergency field kit on the shelf in the corner of the room. Trauma bag, sealed, standard military issue, stocked for 2 casualties with room to improvise for more. She cataloged the spare keys on the pegboard, an old post-utility vehicle, a Bronco-style 4-wheel drive that the motor pool used for perimeter maintenance in the winter months. She cataloged the fuel situation. The gauge on the board said the Bronco had 3/4 of a tank. She took the kit. She took the keys. She took a laminated route map of the Bitterroot access roads from the wallboard, because her phone's GPS was going to be useless in the canyons. She left her Blackridge ID badge on the shelf where the kit had been. She was out of the motor pool lot in under 4 minutes. The access road into the Bitterroot sector was marked with a yellow barricade and a sign that read, "Closed. Weather emergency." Elara looked at it for approximately 2 seconds, then drove around it. The Bronco handled the road better than she expected. The plowing had stopped hours ago, and the drifts were building, but the vehicle had real clearance, and she kept it in low range, reading the surface the way you learn to read unimproved roads in the dark. Not by looking at them directly, but by watching the way the headlights behave at the edges, where the hardpack ends and the soft snow begins. She drove for 90 minutes without seeing another vehicle. The last known coordinates from the transmission were from a signal intercept Torres had marked in the log. She'd copied them before she left. They pointed to a section of the range about 14 kilometers east of the main canyon road, accessible by a mining service track that wasn't on the standard maps, but appeared on the old laminated route chart she'd taken from the wall. She found the turnoff at just past midnight. The service track was barely a track at all. 2 parallel compressions in the landscape where vehicles had once gone regularly and then stopped going, the vegetation reclaiming the edges over years until what remained was more memory than road. The Bronco climbed it in first gear, and twice Elara had to get out in the snow to assess the path ahead before committing to it. She was 2 kilometers up the track when she heard it. Not gunfire, not engines. A sound she recognized from places where the nearest hospital was a 4-hour helicopter ride, and the patients came to her already having survived something that should have killed them. A sound she'd learned to hear through wind and distance and the general noise of situations that were actively trying to end her. Someone was moving through the trees to her left, moving carefully with the stop-and-go rhythm of someone who was hurt and knew it and was managing it anyway. She killed the headlights, sat still. The moving sound stopped. She opened the door quietly and stepped out into the snow. The wind had dropped slightly, and in the relative quiet she could hear her own breathing, the tick of the cooling engine, and nothing else. "I'm a trauma medic," she said. Not loud, just loud enough. "I'm alone. I'm not armed. I came from Fort Callahan." Silence for 3 seconds. Then a voice from the darkness, rough, dry, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been using willpower as a structural support for longer than was reasonable. "How did you find this road?" "Old route map from the motor pool. The transmission pattern from your last contact suggested you'd move north and up, away from the canyon floor where they'd expect you to go. This was the only elevated track in range." A pause. "You analyzed the transmission?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "Are you alone?" the voice said. "Yes." "That's either very smart or very stupid." "Little of both," she said. "Can you come toward the sound of my voice, or do you need me to come to you?" The answer came in the form of movement. She heard it before she saw it. The careful crunch of weight on crusted snow, the irregular rhythm of someone favoring one side. Then a shape materialized out of the dark at the tree line. A large man, tall, moving with the hunched concentration of someone trying to keep something internal from shifting. I was wearing cold-weather tactical gear that had seen better days, and his left hand was pressed against his side in a way that told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. He stopped about 4 feet from her. She could see his face now in the ambient light from the snow. Somewhere in his late 30s. a jaw that had probably been symmetrical before someone had introduced it to a hard surface. Eyes that were alert despite everything, tracking her with the focused assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats, which was the only reason she felt certain he hadn't already decided she was one. "Captain Nolan Reeves," he said, like identification was protocol, even here. "Elara Voss," she said, "trauma medic. Let me look at your side." He didn't move immediately. She'd expected that. Men like this didn't stop being soldiers because they were injured. They evaluated. They calculated. They ran the logic. "The QRF isn't coming," he said. It wasn't a question. "Not tonight. They think you're dead." Something moved across his face. Not surprise. More like a man adjusting to a number he'd already suspected. "How bad is it?" she asked. "The side." "Took a round. It's through and through, I think, but there's something wrong with the pressure. Could be internal." "How long ago?" 19-20 hours. She kept her expression neutral. 20 hours with an internal bleed in sub-zero temperatures, on foot, evading. She had treated men who hadn't survived half that. She had also treated men who had survived worse, and the difference usually came down to two things: how they managed the injury and how much they still wanted to fight. His eyes, despite everything, were still sharp. "Okay," she said, "get in the vehicle." She worked in the back of the Bronco with the overhead light on and the engine running for heat because he was showing early signs of hypothermia on top of everything else, and heat was not optional. She had the trauma bag open across the floor, instrument layout the same way she'd laid it out 100 times in places with worse lighting and worse weather. The wound was through and through, as he'd said. The exit was cleaner than the entry, which was good. The bad news was what she found when she assessed the surrounding tissue. Bruising that suggested internal bleeding from secondary trauma, probably a hard impact against something rigid during the evade. Not immediately catastrophic, but the kind of thing that became catastrophic if you kept moving on it. "You need to be still," she said. "I know that's not what you want to hear. Tell me about the Bitterroot operation." "I don't know the specifics of the operation." "You know enough to be here." She taped the wound packing with practiced efficiency. "I know there was an ambush and your extraction point was destroyed. I know your team got out and you stayed. I know the enemy force shifted to a contain and capture pattern." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful steadiness of someone choosing exactly what they said. "There were 9 of us on the ground. My team is back?" "As of my last information, yes." He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "The enemy force, you said contain and capture. They were still in the area?" "Were. Your transmission fragments showed they were moving toward the northern canyon route, which is why you went up instead of down. Smart call." She finished the secondary dressing and moved to check his temperature. "But they'll have the main canyon approach blocked by morning. We have maybe 4 hours before this road is under surveillance." He looked at her. "You planned an egress before you came up here?" "I planned 3. The look he gave her wasn't surprise exactly. It was the recalibration of someone realizing they had misjudged a situation. "Who are you?" he said. Not like it was small talk. She looked up from the thermometer, held his gaze for a second. "Right now I'm the person keeping you alive," she said. "We can get into the rest of it when you're not bleeding." She went back to work. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows, and the dark beyond the glass was absolute and total, and without interest in either of them. The Bronco sat on the mountain track like a small, warm impossibility in the middle of all that cold. Reeves watched her work. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. By the time she had him stabilized as she could make him in the back of a borrowed vehicle on a dirt track in the middle of a whiteout, the thermometer read better, his color had improved marginally, and the internal pressure concern, while still present, had not worsened in the last 40 minutes. That was enough for now. She repacked the trauma bag with the methodical care of someone who had learned that the supplies you needed most were always the ones you'd left behind because you were in too much of a hurry. Then she climbed into the front seat, pulled the door shut, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. "There are 2 egress routes that should still be open," she said. "One goes south through the secondary canyon, comes out near the old Timberline station, adds about 40 minutes but keeps us off the main road. The other is direct, faster, but we'd be exposed on the ridge for about half a mile." Reeves had pulled himself into a sitting position, carefully, with the controlled discomfort of someone who was used to operating through pain and wasn't planning on stopping. How confident are you on the southern route? I've driven it once 3 years ago. It was passable then. In November? In November. Different weather than tonight, but the road base was solid. He thought for a moment. Take the southern route. She nodded, started the engine. Voss? He said from the back seat. She looked up at the mirror. Thank you. She didn't say you're welcome. She put the Bronco in gear and pointed it back down the mountain track, reading the darkness ahead, the way she'd been reading it all night. Not looking directly at it, but watching the edges, where the known ended and the unknown began. Behind them, somewhere in the trees above, something shifted in the dark. She pressed the accelerator. They moved. The southern route held, barely. There were 2 points on the descent where Elara had to make decisions she didn't have time to second-guess. A section where the road had washed partially into the hillside, leaving maybe 6 feet of drivable surface before a drop she couldn't see the bottom of, and a stretch of ice near the canyon bend that the Bronco took sideways for about 40 feet before the tires found something solid underneath. Both times she drove through it the same way. Hands at a fixed position on the wheel, speed steady, no corrections until she had traction data to correct with. Reeves didn't say anything during either moment. She appreciated that. They came out near the Timberline station at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. The station itself was dark, a seasonal ranger post, closed since October, its shuttered windows collecting snow in the corners like parentheses. Elara pulled the Bronco around to the south side of the structure, out of the wind, and cut the engine. We stop here? Reeves asked. 10 minutes. I need to check the dressing. She climbed into the back and unwrapped the outer layer. The packing had held, but there was more saturation than she wanted to see. Not catastrophic, the bleeding hadn't broken through to the secondary layer. But the internal pressure concern was something she couldn't properly assess out here, in a vehicle, with what she had. She needed imaging. She needed a surgical bay. What she had was a headlamp and a trauma kit and a captain who was doing a remarkable job of pretending he wasn't as bad off as he was. How's the pain? She asked. Managed. On a scale. I don't do scales. Make an exception. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had learned that stonewalling worked on most people and was adjusting to the fact that she wasn't most people. 6, he said. Maybe 7 when I breathe deep. She nodded. Replace the outer layer. Internal bleeding is still a concern. I can't rule it out in the field. We need to get you to surgical imaging within... She stopped, calculated. 6 hours. Preferably 4. Fort Callahan's closest. Fort Callahan is where Graves is. A pause. Tell me about Graves, Reeves said. She sat back on her heels. The headlamp threw a narrow wedge of light across the cargo space between them, and in it she could see the careful, deliberate patience of a man who asked questions like an interview. Not because he didn't know what he wanted, but because he wanted to see how she answered it. He runs the medical operations at Blackridge, she said. He's the reason nobody came for you tonight. Explain that. I flagged the transmission pattern to him at 2100 hours. He dismissed it, told me I didn't have the tactical background to analyze military communications, and ordered me off the post. She paused. He was more concerned about the breach in protocol than the information. Reeves was quiet for a moment. And you came anyway. I came anyway. He looked at her in that measuring way again. It wasn't suspicion exactly. It was the look of a man trying to reconcile 2 things that didn't quite fit together yet. You said you had more tactical background than anyone at the hospital. She didn't answer immediately. I said that to Graves on the phone, she said. I shouldn't have. Why did you? She started repacking the kit. Because it was true and I was angry. He let that sit. What's the background? He said. She zipped the bag shut. Later. You keep saying that. Because we keep not being in a safe place to have that conversation. She looked up. Right now I need to know if you have any secondary contacts. Anyone outside the standard command chain who can receive our position without it going through Callahan's coordination center. Reeves blinked. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket with the careful movement of someone who had been guarding that pocket all night, and produced a compact satellite communicator, military-grade, ruggedized, the kind that wasn't issued through standard channels. He held it out. My team sergeant, he said, Calloway. He'll be monitoring a secondary frequency. She took the device. What's his cover call? Ridgeline 7. She keyed the frequency. identified with the call sign Reeves gave her, and transmitted their position coordinates and a brief medical status report in the compressed language she'd learned in a different life. She kept it under 30 seconds. Then she clicked off and handed the device back. "He'll have it," Reeves said. "And he won't route it through Callahan?" "Not Calloway." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, and then thought better of it. "He has a complicated relationship with command channels." She climbed back into the front seat and started the engine. "We keep moving. I know a secondary access point for Blackridge. Maintenance road on the south side of the installation comes out near the civilian contractor parking. If I can get you there without going through the main gate, we can reach the emergency surgical bay without Graves being the first call. And if he is the first call, then we deal with it." She pulled out from behind the ranger station and pointed the Bronco back toward the highway. The storm had eased slightly, not stopped, but backed down from active assault to something more like sustained pressure. The road ahead was still a study in white and dark, but the visibility had opened to maybe 50 feet, which was 50 feet more than it had been 2 hours ago. She drove. They made the highway at 2:30 and the Blackridge Perimeter Road by 3:15. She killed the headlights 400 meters from the maintenance entrance and ran the last stretch, on what light the snow itself threw back. Enough to see by, barely, if you trusted your eyes and kept your speed down. The maintenance gate was padlocked. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the man standing next to it. He was a large man, wider than tall, gave the impression, built with the kind of density that came from years of actual physical work rather than deliberate conditioning. He was wearing a civilian jacket over what looked like fatigues, and he had both hands visible, which was the first thing she checked. He stepped into the dim wash of light as she stopped the Bronco, and she recognized the careful, non-threatening body language of someone who had positioned themselves exactly this way on purpose. She rolled down the window 2 inches. "You Voss?" the man said. "Depends on who's asking." "Calloway, Ridgeline 7. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, and produced the satellite communicator's twin. "Captain sent me the secondary frequency call. I've been here 20 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the gate. "Can you open that?" "Already did." He walked to the padlock and lifted it. Unlatched, she saw, the shackle hanging open. He swung the gate inward. "Got a key. Don't ask." She pulled the Bronco through. Calloway was a man of about 40, with a weathered, careful face, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a lot of time in situations where being loud was how you got yourself killed. He looked into the back of the vehicle at Reeves with the expression of a man who was working very hard not to show what he felt. "Captain." "Calloway." Reeves's voice was rougher than it had been at the Timberline station. Elara noted that without letting it show on her face. "Lose the look." "Yes, sir." Calloway looked at Elara. "What does he need?" "Surgical imaging, IV access, possibly exploration for internal bleeding. He's been field stabilized for about 2 hours. The wound itself is manageable. The secondary trauma concern is not." "Who do you need inside?" "Dr. Fenton, surgical attending. She's on the overnight roster. Nobody else until he's in the bay." Calloway was already pulling out his phone. "Give me 4 minutes. The next 40 minutes existed in the compressed, detail-saturated time that Elara had learned to operate in during the years she'd spent in places where she was the only medical resource within 100 miles. There was no margin for error in those minutes, so she used them the way she'd always used them. Not by hurrying, which was how people made fatal mistakes, but by moving with the complete absence of wasted motion that looked like hurry from the outside and felt like controlled stillness from the inside. Dr. Mira Fenton met them at the maintenance entrance to the surgical wing, still pulling her hair back, moving fast, with the slightly unfinished look of someone who had been asleep 2 hours ago. She took one look at Reeves and shifted into a register Elara recognized, the clinical, focused neutrality of a good physician absorbing a situation and already beginning to organize it. "Through and through GSW 19 to 20 hours ago," Elara said as they moved. "Field packed. Secondary dressing applied approximately 90 minutes ago. Signs of secondary blunt trauma to the lower left thorax. Possible internal bleed unconfirmed. Vitals were compensating when I last checked 30 minutes ago. BP? 94/61 when I had the cuff on him. He's been declining slowly." Fenton looked at her. How do you have his BP from the field? I had a travel cuff in the kit. A pause. Fenton processed this. Okay, Bay 3 is prepped. I've got Hendricks for anesthesia. He's coming from the call room. You didn't page the duty coordinator? You said Fenton only. Good. They moved Reeves from the Bronco to a gurney that Calloway had somehow produced, and from there through the maintenance corridor to the surgical wing. Reeves was awake and tracking, which was good. He was also pale in a way that had progressed since the Timberline stop, which was not good. He caught Elara's eye once as they wheeled him through the corridor. You good? He said. I'm not the one on the gurney. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. Yeah, she said. I'm good. It was only partially true. Her hands were steady, her head was clear, but there was a specific kind of exhaustion that accumulated over hours of sustained high-stakes decision-making in bad conditions, the kind that didn't announce itself until the crisis passed, and she could feel it beginning to gather at the edges of her awareness like weather on the horizon. She filed it away. Later. They reached Bay 3. That was when the door at the end of the corridor opened. Muck. Denton Graves was wearing his uniform. That was the first thing she registered, the fact that he was fully dressed at 3:40 in the morning, which meant someone had called him, and whoever had called him had done it before she and Reeves arrived, which meant the maintenance entrance hadn't been as unobserved as she'd hoped. He walked into the corridor with two men from the post-security detail behind him, and he stopped when he saw the gurney. His expression cycled through three things very quickly: surprise, recognition, and then something that settled into a kind of controlled fury. He looked at Reeves. Then he looked at Elara. Stop, he said. Nobody stopped. I said stop. His voice carried the snap of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. This man has not been processed through the emergency intake protocol. This is a potential combat casualty, which means there's a required security assessment before. He's a SEAL captain with a gunshot wound and a possible internal bleed. Elara kept moving. Do the security assessment after he's stable. Voss. Graves stepped to the side, physically interposing himself between the gurney and Bay 3's door. You don't work here. You surrendered your credentials 8 hours ago. You are currently on a military installation without authorization. You illegally accessed classified communications equipment, and you removed government property from the motor pool. He looked at Reeves. Captain, you'll need to wait for— Get out of the way, Reeves said. His voice was quiet. Quieter than anything else in the corridor, the kind of quiet that didn't ask. Graves looked at him. Captain, I understand what you're doing, Reeves said. I understand why you're doing it. But if you're standing between me and a surgical bay in the next 30 seconds, because of a paperwork dispute, I will remember that for a very long time. He held Graves' gaze. Move. Graves stood there for a moment that lasted about 3 times longer than it should have. Then he stepped aside. Fenton pushed through the bay doors without looking at Graves. Calloway went in behind her. The security detail stood in the corridor and looked at each other and then at Graves, waiting for an instruction he didn't give. Elara started to follow Reeves through the bay doors. Voss? She stopped. She turned around. Graves was standing in the corridor with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. What he could do, what it would cost him, what it would cost her. He was a man who dealt in those calculations, who had built his authority on them. This isn't finished, he said. No, she said. It isn't. She pushed through the bay doors. The surgical assessment took 22 minutes. Fenton confirmed the internal bleeding, a laceration to the lower splenic region, secondary to blunt trauma, consistent with impact against a rock face or similar surface during the evasion. Serious. Manageable with intervention, not the kind of thing that would have been manageable in another 4 or 5 hours. Reeves went into the OR at 4:15. Elara sat in the corridor outside Bay 3 and leaned her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light above her was flickering slightly at one end, a fast, irregular flutter that would have driven most people to distraction, but that she found almost meditative in this particular moment. Something to look at that required nothing from her. Calloway appeared from around the corner with 2 cups of vending machine coffee. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it. She took it. He sat down against the opposite wall, long legs stretched out, looking at his cup. You drove into the Bitterroots in a whiteout, he said. Alone. Yes. Using an old motor pool vehicle and a laminated map. Yes. He looked at his coffee. I've been doing this job for 16 years. That's the stupidest thing I've heard of. A pause. Also the most effective. She almost smiled. Almost. How long has he been on your team? She asked. Reeves, 4 years, best officer I've worked with. He said it the way people state known facts, without decoration. You weren't going to find him dead. I wasn't sure of that. But you came anyway. But I came anyway. Calloway nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. Then he looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who had decided to say the thing he'd been deciding whether to say. The way you moved through that corridor, the way you talked to Fenton, the way you knew to use a secondary frequency and keep the transmission under 30 seconds. He paused. That's not hospital nursing. Elara turned the cup in her hands. No, she said, it isn't. He didn't push. She appreciated that too. Graves' formal complaint was filed at 6 in the morning. She knew because Calloway found her at 5:58 to tell her it was coming. He'd been monitoring communications the way team sergeants monitor everything when their officer is on a surgical table, completely, without gaps, because gaps are where bad things happen. It's going to the post commander, Calloway said. Unauthorized access to classified communications. Theft of government property. Practicing medicine without authorization on federal premises. He listed them without inflection. He's also flagging you for falsification of credentials. I haven't falsified anything. I know. He's claiming your nursing credentials were misrepresented when you were hired. She looked at him. Is that something he can make stick? He said. My credentials are legitimate, she said. What's in my file beyond the nursing credentials is a different question. Calloway was quiet for a moment. How different? She didn't answer. He looked at her. Then he made a decision. She could see it happen, the small shift in his face as he stopped asking and started accepting. What do you need? I need to make a phone call before his complaint reaches the post commander's desk. She stood up. And I need to make it from somewhere Graves can't intercept. Use my personal cell. It's a civilian number. He held it out. Whoever you need to reach them. She took the phone. She walked to the end of the corridor, past the range of the security cameras she'd noted on the way in, and turned the corner. She stood in the narrow, dead space between the ice machine and the stairwell door, where the camera angles didn't quite reach, and she dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. It rang 4 times. 4, then Voss. The voice was female, flat, without greeting, in the way of someone who had identified the number before answering and was not surprised by it. It's been a while. I know. Are you all right? I need a favor. It's time sensitive. A pause. Tell me. She told her. Briefly, with the same compression she used for everything. Not because she was hiding details, but because the important things didn't need more words than they needed. The Blackridge situation. Graves. Reeves. The complaint being filed. When she finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds on the other end. Who's the post commander at Callahan? The voice asked. Brigadier General Harlow. I know Harlow. Give me 40 minutes. The line went dead. Elara stood in the dead space by the ice machine and listened to the building around her. The mechanical hum of the hospital's systems. The distant sound of a phone ringing somewhere in the administrative wing. The almost imperceptible sound of an institution operating on procedures and hierarchies and the authority of men who had built those procedures to protect themselves. She thought about Graves in his neat uniform at 3:40 in the morning. She thought about the way he'd stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, doing the calculation. She thought about Owens, the young private with the dropping oxygen sat and the blue-tinged lips, going through intake with his paperwork while the pneumothorax developed. She went back to the OR waiting area. Reeves was still in surgery. It was 6:20 in the morning, and the pale, flat light of a winter dawn was beginning to come through the single east-facing window at the end of the corridor, laying a thin gray stripe across the linoleum. Calloway was on his feet when she came back. He'd been on the phone himself. My team is here, he said. They came in from the south access point 30 minutes ago. 6 operators, all present. He paused. When Graves' security detail tries to move you out of the building, it won't just be them in the corridor. She looked at him. I don't want this to become a confrontation. It already is a confrontation. I'm just making sure it's an even one. She couldn't argue with that. The OR doors opened at 7:04. Fenton came out still in her surgical gown, mask pulled down, looking tired and competent and satisfied in the quiet way of a surgeon who had done what she came to do. She found Elara immediately. "He's stable," she said. "The splenic lac was repaired. No additional complications. He's going to need 4 to 6 weeks of recovery, but he is going to recover." Elara let out a breath she hadn't been measuring. "He's asking for you," Fenton added. "Before he's out of recovery, he says he needs to speak to you." "Is he lucid enough?" "Lucid enough to be annoying about it, yes." She went in. The recovery bay had the specific smell of every post-surgical space she'd ever been in, antiseptic and warmed plastic, and the faint metallic undertone that she'd long since stopped noticing as anything except background. Reeves was in the second bed, partially elevated, an IV line in his left arm and a pulse oximeter on his right index finger, and the particular exhausted clarity of someone who had been through anesthesia and come out the other side still fundamentally himself. He looked at her when she came in. "Fenton says you were right about the internal bleed," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation tube. "Says another few hours and we'd have been having a different conversation." "We weren't having a different conversation. Because of you." He held her gaze. "I want to know why. The real answer." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "I heard something in your transmission," she said. "The pattern. I've heard it before and I know what it means and I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it." "That's the how. I'm asking the why. Why did you drive into the mountains alone in a blizzard for a man you'd never met?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the people who were supposed to come for you didn't," she said. "And I knew how to. And I've spent 3 years telling myself those two facts together don't obligate me to anything." She paused. "Turns out they do." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What's in your file, Voss? The part that isn't the nursing credentials?" She looked at her hands. She was about to answer, was actually forming the first words of it, when the door to the recovery bay opened. It wasn't Calloway. It wasn't Fenton. It was a man she had never seen before, in a suit, with a military ID badge clipped to his breast pocket. He was accompanied by another man in uniform, not Graves, someone higher, with the kind of rank insignia that didn't appear at a hospital operations level. They both stopped when they saw her. The suited man looked at her with the particular attention of someone who had been briefed. "Elara Voss," he said. Not a question. She stood up slowly. "I'm Agent Durall," he said. "Defense Intelligence. We need to speak with you immediately." He paused. "You made a phone call this morning to a number registered to a classified federal directory." Another pause. "We've been looking for you for a while, Ms. Voss. You're much harder to find than you should be." In the bed behind her, she heard Reeves shift. "Agent," Reeves said, his voice still rough but very deliberate. "Whatever you're here for, she's the reason I'm alive right now. I want that in your record before anything else." Durall looked at Reeves, then back at Elara. "We know," he said. "That's actually part of why we're here." The pale morning light from the corridor window had strengthened while they'd been talking, and now it lay across the recovery bay floor in a hard, definite line. The kind of light that didn't leave room for shadows or ambiguity or the comfortable gray space where things could be kept quiet. Elara looked at the two men in the doorway. She looked at Reeves. She looked at the IV line in his arm and the monitor reading above his bed, steady and even and alive. Then she looked back at Durall. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." The room they put her in wasn't an interrogation room, technically. It was a conference space on the second floor of Blackridge's administrative wing, a rectangular room with a laminate table, 6 chairs, and a window that looked out over the staff parking lot. But the two men who sat across from her had the particular stillness of people who were not there to have a conference, and the door had been closed with the kind of deliberate quiet that meant it was going to stay that way until they were finished. Agent Durall set a folder on the table. He didn't open it. The uniformed man, he'd introduced himself as Colonel Strand out of the DIA's Operational Assessment Division, folded his hands and looked at her with the evaluating patience of someone who had conducted a lot of these conversations and was not in a hurry. "How much do you want us to know?" Durall said. Elara looked at him. "That's an unusual opening." "It's an unusual situation." He glanced at the folder. "We have a file on you. Parts of it are complete. Parts of it have gaps that were very deliberately created by someone with the clearance to create them. He paused. We're not here to fill in those gaps for you. We're here because of what happened last night, and because the phone call you made this morning went to a number we've been monitoring for unrelated reasons. Who answered? She said. Someone you apparently trust enough to call at 6 in the morning after a night like the one you just had. She waited. Strand spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, with the flat cadence of someone who chose words the way an accountant chooses figures, precisely, with an awareness of what each one cost. Ms. Voss, before we go further, I want to establish something. Nothing you say in this room today is being recorded for formal proceedings. This conversation is preliminary and informal. You are not under investigation. Graves filed a complaint. Graves' complaint has been received and is being evaluated in the context of last night's events. Strand paused. The recovery of Captain Reeves is not a small thing. A SEAL officer, alive, who should by all available intelligence have been declared KIA by morning. He looked at her. That changes the shape of the conversation significantly. She looked at the folder on the table. What's in there? Durrell's hand moved to it. He opened it, turned it so she could see the top page. It was her photograph. Younger, maybe 8 or 9 years younger, with the look of someone who hadn't yet learned to make her face unreadable. Below the photo, a name, not Elara Voss. A different name, her name from before, attached to a service record she had spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up. How long have you had this? She said. The file? Years, Durrell said. Your location? Since this morning. He closed the folder. You did a thorough job of the transition. Nursing credentials are legitimate. We checked. The employment history in Forsyth checks out. You didn't make mistakes, he paused. You made one phone call. She thought about the number she'd dialed, about the woman on the other end who had answered without surprise. What do you want? Elara said. Strand leaned forward slightly. What we want is to understand what happened last night. Specifically, how a contract nurse at a military hospital ends up in possession of the tactical knowledge, the field medical capability, and the decision-making framework to do what you did. Because what you did last night is not in the skill set of a contract nurse. He paused. It's in the skill set of someone with a very specific background. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the parking lot was beginning to fill with the morning shift. Civilians and contractors and base personnel moving through the residual snow with the hurried, head-down efficiency of people who had somewhere to be. Normal. Unremarkable. The kind of scene that made what had happened in the last 12 hours feel like something from a different world. She supposed it was. I left the program 3 years ago, she said. Clean separation, properly documented. We know, Durrell said. We're not disputing that. Then what are you disputing? Nothing. He held her gaze. We're here because of Graves. She stopped. Specifically, Strand said, because of what Graves did with your application when you came to Blackridge 11 months ago. He reached into the folder and produced a second page, a document she recognized as her own employment application, but annotated in a hand she didn't recognize with 2 sections highlighted in yellow. When your application came to him for review, he ran a background check, standard procedure. The nursing credentials came back clean, but the field program reference you listed, a civilian trauma consulting organization in Helena, triggered a secondary flag in the system. Nothing definitive, just a flag. And he buried it, she said. He buried it, Durrell confirmed. Specifically, he removed the flag notation from your file and approved your contract with the note that your background was wholly civilian in nature, which it is not. He paused. The question is why? She thought about it for a moment. The way Graves had looked at her on the floor the night she'd challenged him about Owens. The particular quality of his hostility, not just the arrogance of a man who didn't like being questioned, but something more pointed, something that had known or suspected who it was looking at. He didn't want it surfaced, she said slowly. If my background came out, the real background, it would have raised questions about why he was the one making the call on that floor, about what I knew that he didn't. More than that, Strand said, Graves has been operating as the primary medical authority at Blackridge for 6 years. In that time, there have been 4 formal complaints from staff about his clinical decision-making, All 4 were dismissed at the command level. He paused. 2 of those complaints involved delayed treatment decisions for combat casualties. The weight of that settled in the room. Elara thought about Owens. She thought about the oxygen saturation reading, 91 and dropping. She thought about the intake form. "How many?" she said. Her voice came out flat. Strand looked at his hands. "We don't have confirmed numbers yet. The review is ongoing. How many people are we talking about who were affected by his delays?" "At least 6 documented cases where treatment timelines were extended beyond clinical standards. In 2 of those cases, the outcomes were significantly worse than they should have been." He met her eyes. "Not fatalities, but close." She sat with that. Dural said, "When you flagged the Bitterroot transmission last night, that wasn't the first time you'd challenged him." "No. The incident in the trauma bay earlier in the evening with the private Owens." "Yes." "You called the attending over his explicit instruction." "Yes." "And his response was to pull your floor access." "Yes." Dural nodded slowly. "He's done it before. Different staff members, different incidents, same pattern." He paused. "You were the first one who came back at him with something he couldn't dismiss, because unlike the others, you knew exactly what you were looking at." The room was quiet again for a moment. Then Strand said, "Ms. Voss, we need to formally review your background, not to penalize you. Your separation was legitimate, and we're not here to challenge it. But in the context of the Graves investigation, your assessment of the Bitterroot transmission and your decision to act on it are significant. You may be called as a witness." He paused. "We'd also like your help with something else." She waited. "Reeves is stable, but the Bitterroot operation is still active in terms of the intelligence picture. The enemy force that conducted the ambush, the contain and capture pattern you identified. We need to understand how you read that so quickly, because our own analysis team didn't catch it until 3 hours after you called Graves." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a criticism of our team. It's a recognition that you identified something specific, something that required a kind of pattern familiarity that comes from direct experience." He paused. "We need to know what experience." She looked at the closed folder on the table between them. At the photograph of a younger version of herself attached to a name she hadn't used in 3 years. She looked out the window at the parking lot, at the ordinary world going about its ordinary morning. Then she looked back at Strand. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you." She talked for 40 minutes. Not everything. Some things had been sealed in the separation agreement in ways that couldn't be unsaid, and she respected that even now. But the operational framework, the specific theaters where she'd worked, the pattern recognition she'd developed over years of trauma response in environments, where the difference between a dead patient and a living one came down to reading the situation faster than the situation was developing, that she gave them. Cleanly, without drama, in the same direct shorthand she used for everything. Dural took notes. Strand mostly listened. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Strand said, "You were attached to a CSAR element in the Kandahar region for 18 months. Among other places. That's where the contain and capture pattern comes from. You'd seen it before." 3 times. Twice we got there in time, once we didn't. She paused. The auditory signature in the transmission, the way the enemy was moving relative to Reeves' position, what he was describing in shorthand, it matched what I'd heard before, specifically. And the medical field response, treating an internal bleed in a vehicle in sub-zero conditions. "I've done worse in worse places." She said it without pride. Just fact. Dural set his pen down. He looked at her with the first expression he'd used that didn't feel calibrated. "Why did you leave?" She looked at him. "The program," he said. "You were decorated. Your record, the parts we can see, are exceptional. You left voluntarily." He paused. "Why?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the various versions of the answer she'd tried over the years. The diplomatic ones, the vague ones, the ones that were technically accurate without being true. "I brought someone home once," she said. "A pilot, 23 years old. He'd been held for 11 days. By the time we got to him, there wasn't... The injuries were survivable, technically. He survived." She paused. "I sat with him for 6 hours on the evac flight while he processed being alive again. And I realized somewhere in that 6 hours that I was better at the crisis than at everything after it. and that the after was where he was going to need the most from the people around him, and I wasn't built for it the way I was. She looked at her hands. So I left. I thought if I stepped back, found something quieter, something where the stakes were lower, I'd figure out how to be useful in the after. And, Dural said, and it turns out the stakes found me anyway. Strand looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted during the last part of what she'd said. Not softened exactly, but changed in character. Graves' complaint, he said. Unauthorized access, theft of government property, practicing medicine without authorization. He'll pursue it. I know. The nursing board will likely open a review. I know that too. You could face suspension of your nursing credentials while the review is ongoing. She nodded. That doesn't seem to concern you, Strand said. It concerns me, she said. It just doesn't change anything I did last night. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, closed his folder. I need to make some calls, he said. I'd ask that you remain on the installation for now. Not as a restriction. You're not detained. But there are conversations that are going to happen in the next few hours, and it would be useful to have you available. Reeves' team, she said. Calloway and the others, they're here. We know. We'll speak with them separately. He moved toward the door, stopped, looked back. Voss, for what it's worth, what you did last night took something beyond competence. I've worked with a lot of people who have the right training and the right background and still couldn't have done what you did. He paused. I wanted to say that. He left. Dural gathered his materials more slowly. At the door he turned. The woman you called this morning. She's going to be in contact, before the end of the day. Elara looked up. She's the one who pointed us here, he said. She's been watching your situation for a while. He paused. She said to tell you, you should have called sooner. He left. Elara sat alone in the conference room and looked at the empty table in front of her. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, the thin gray light replaced by something whiter and more definite, bouncing off the snow in the parking lot with the indifferent brightness of a winter day that had no interest in the difficulty of what had come before it. She sat there for a while. Then she stood up and went back to the recovery wing. Reeves was awake. More awake than he should have been, probably, but she was learning that his baseline level of function under adverse conditions was not a useful reference point for most people. He had the head of the bed elevated, the IV still running, and a look on his face that said he'd been thinking rather than resting, which was almost certainly against Fenton's instructions. Calloway was in the chair by the window. He looked at her when she came in. DIA? Yes. Graves? They were looking at him. Something in Calloway's face shifted. A small, hard satisfaction that he allowed for exactly 1 second before it disappeared. Good, he said. Reeves said, sit down. It wasn't unfriendly. It was the same deliberate quiet he'd used in the corridor with Graves. She sat. Calloway told me what you did at the motor pool, he said. The kit, the vehicle. I gave back the vehicle. That's not... He stopped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his approach. I'm trying to thank you. I'm not doing it well. You said thank you in the recovery bay. That was sufficient. Voss? He looked at her. I've been in tight situations. Situations where someone had to make a decision with incomplete information and everything going wrong, and they made it anyway. Good ones and bad ones. He paused. Last night was one of the good ones. I want you to know I understand what it cost. She looked at him. At the IV line, at the monitor, at the living fact of him in a hospital bed 12 hours after everyone had written him off. It didn't cost me anything I wasn't already prepared to spend, she said. The DIA interview, he said. What did they want? My background, the Bitterroot transmission analysis, Graves. She paused. They're building a case. Against Graves? Yes. Reeves was quiet for a moment. He knew who you were. It wasn't quite a question. She looked at him. When he pulled your floor access, Reeves said. That wasn't just authority. That was personal. He knew something. He flagged my application when I arrived, she said. Found a reference that pointed somewhere he wasn't supposed to look. He buried the flag and kept me at arm's length. She paused. I think he suspected what my background was, and he kept me close enough to monitor and far enough away to control. Until you stopped being controllable. Until I stopped being controllable, Calloway said from the window. He's going to push the complaint hard. He's not the kind of man who accepts a loss gracefully. No, she said. He isn't. Reeves said, let him push. There's a captain alive in this recovery bay and a nursing board complaint in the other direction. One of those things is going to matter more than the other. He looked at her steadily. You know that, right? She wasn't sure she did, actually. She'd been in enough institutions to know that the thing that should matter more wasn't always the thing that won. Graves had 6 years of authority at Blackridge, relationships with people in the command structure, and the particular advantage of a man who had made himself necessary. She had a patient who was alive who wouldn't otherwise be. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. She was about to say something honest about that when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An unknown number. Civilian, not military. She stepped into the corridor. Voss, she said. It's Petra. The voice from 6 in the morning. Close her now, somehow. Or maybe that was just the daylight making things feel less like emergency. I've been on the phone for the last 2 hours. Are you all right? I'm all right. Reeves? Stable? Surgical repair? Good prognosis. Good. A pause. The DIA found you. Yes. I sent them. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you first. By the time I understood the shape of things, they were already moving. Another pause. Dural is trustworthy. Strand is more complicated, but he's honest. If he tells you something, it's accurate. They told me you've been watching the situation. I've been watching Graves, Petra said. I've been watching him for about 8 months. Since a casualty review board flagged 2 cases from Blackridge with anomalous treatment timelines, and it ended up on my desk. A pause. I didn't know you were there until your employment record surfaced in the background check I ran on the hospital's clinical staff. Elara stood in the corridor and thought about that. About Petra having her file and watching Blackridge for 8 months and not calling. Why didn't you contact me? Because you left, Petra said simply. You left clean and you built something else, and I wasn't going to pull you back into it unless I had to. A pause. Last night qualified as having to. The investigation into Graves is going to proceed regardless of what he does with his complaint against you. But you need to understand something, Voss. He knows it's proceeding. Someone inside the administrative chain at Callahan tipped him off this morning. Her voice was flat and precise. He's not going to sit still for it. Elara's hand tightened slightly on the phone. What does that mean? She said. It means he has 6 years of relationships in that building. It means he has access to documentation that could be selectively presented to make last night look different than it was. A pause. And it means there's a specific piece of your file, the sealed portion, that he's apparently been trying to access since this morning. The corridor felt different suddenly. The ordinary bustle of the hospital morning, the carts, the footsteps, the distant PA announcements, took on a different quality, like a backdrop that had been painted to look normal and was starting to show the brushstrokes. He can't access the sealed portion, Elara said. He doesn't have the clearance. No, but he has someone who does. Petra paused. I'm working on it. But Voss, you need to be careful in that building today. Don't go anywhere alone if you can avoid it. Keep Calloway or someone from the team close. Petra, I know you can handle yourself. That's not what I'm saying. Her voice was unambiguous. I'm saying that a man with 6 years of built authority, who is watching that authority come apart, is unpredictable in ways that competence doesn't protect against. Elara thought about Graves at 3:40 in the morning, standing in the corridor in his neat uniform. She thought about the calculation she'd seen in his eyes. She thought about a man who had buried her file twice, once on her arrival, once in the complaint he'd filed 6 hours ago, because he understood instinctively that the best way to manage something he couldn't control was to make it invisible. She also thought about the fact that it had stopped working. 40 minutes, Petra said. I'll have more for you then. The line went dead. She stood in the corridor. At the far end, near the elevator bank, she could see 2 of Calloway's operators leaning against the wall in civilian clothes, deliberately casual, deliberately present. Calloway had positioned them before the DIA arrived, before anyone knew exactly what the morning was going to bring. Because that was what team sergeants did when their officer was vulnerable. They controlled the space. She walked back into the recovery bay. Calloway read her face before she said anything. What? Graves knows the investigation is moving, she said, and he's trying to access my sealed service record. Calloway was on his feet. He can't. He has someone with the clearance. She looked at Reeves. I need the team in position on this floor. Not visible. I don't want him to know they're here, but close. Reeves said, Done. He looked at Calloway. One word. Calloway was out the door in 30 seconds. Elara sat back down in the chair by the bed. She looked at the monitor above Reeves. Steady, even, the line tracing its patient and repetitive record of a heartbeat that was still going. You think he'll make a move today? Reeves said. I think a man who has gotten away with things for 6 years and is watching that end doesn't wait around to see how it turns out. She looked at her hands. He'll try to control the narrative. He'll try to find something in my record he can use to discredit the whole night. Is there something? She thought about it honestly. Nothing that would hold under real scrutiny. But real scrutiny takes time, and in the meantime, a sealed record with suspicious gaps is enough to create doubt, especially in an administrative proceeding. She paused. That's all he needs. Enough doubt to buy enough time to find his footing. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Voss, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me a straight answer. She looked at him. Everything in that sealed record, he said. Everything you did, everywhere you went, is any of it something you're ashamed of? She held his gaze for a long moment. No, she said. Then let him find it, Reeves said. Let him put every page of it on the table. Because whatever it says, it also says you know how to read a combat transmission in a blizzard and drive into the mountains alone and bring a wounded man home. He paused. That's not a record that destroys you. That's a record that ends him. She sat with that. She was still sitting with it when the PA system in the hallway outside crackled to life. Not the routine announcement tone, but the sharp double tone that preceded an emergency broadcast. Code Black, Administrative Wing, 2nd floor. Code Black, Administrative Wing, 2nd floor. All non-essential personnel clear the area. Code Black. Threat on the premises. She was on her feet before the announcement finished. Reeves was already reaching for the call button to lock down the room. She pushed through the recovery bay door and into the corridor, and she saw Calloway at the far end. Not running, moving fast and controlled, with one of his operators beside him and both of them heading toward the elevator bank. She went after them. What is it? She said, catching Calloway's arm. He turned. His face had the flat operational quality of someone who had shifted registers entirely. Security camera caught Graves in the file room on the 2nd floor, administrative wing. He's not alone, 2 men with him, civilian clothes. He paused. They're pulling physical records. Someone called it in. Which records? Calloway looked at her. Voss, he said. They're pulling yours. The elevator doors opened. Inside, holding a manila folder thick with documents against his chest, stood Denton Graves. Behind him, the 2 men Calloway had described. Graves looked at Elara across the 6 feet of corridor between them with the expression of a man who had made his calculation and committed to it. He looked at the folder in his hands, then he looked back at her, and he smiled. The smile lasted exactly as long as it took Calloway to step forward. He didn't touch Graves. He didn't have to. He simply moved. One deliberate step that put him between the elevator and the corridor, with his operator beside him and his hands visible and relaxed in the way of someone who had been in enough situations to know that visible and relaxed was more intimidating than tense. The 2 men behind Graves registered this immediately. One of them shifted his weight backward toward the elevator's rear wall. Graves held his ground. He was good at that, the performance of holding ground. 6 years had made him very good at it. Colonel, Calloway said. His voice was conversational, completely conversational. Those files need to go back. These are hospital administrative records, Graves said. I have full authority over the administrative documentation of staff under my... Those are her records, Calloway said. And you're not her command authority. You're not anyone's command authority right now. He paused. The DIA is on this floor. I'd strongly suggest you hand those over before they come around that corner and find you holding them. Graves looked at Elara over Calloway's shoulder. The smile was gone now, replaced by something more considered, more calculated. It was the face of a man who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it, or thought he had. Voss, he said, you know what's in here. You know what it says about the decisions you made, about the program you were part of. He held the folder slightly forward, not offering it, just making it visible. You want this opened in a formal review? You want every notation in here read aloud in front of a military board? She looked at the folder. She thought about what Reeves had said. Let him put every page of it on the table. Yes, she said. Actually, something shifted in Graves' expression. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional recalibration. But she'd spent enough time reading the small signals that people produced when they were adjusting to something they hadn't expected, and she caught it cleanly. He hadn't expected that. Behind her, from the direction of the stairwell, she heard the door open. Dural came around the corner first, with Strand 2 steps behind him, and they both stopped when they took in the scene. Graves in the elevator doorway, the folder, Calloway, Elara. Dural looked at the folder. Then he looked at Graves. "Colonel," he said, with a courtesy that had a floor and a ceiling and not much space between them. "I'm going to need you to step out of the elevator." The next 3 hours moved the way consequential things always moved. Not in a straight line, but in the branching, overlapping pattern of multiple people making decisions simultaneously in the same space without full information about what the others were doing. Elara had seen it in the field, and she recognized it now. The particular chaos of a situation that had shifted from one person's control to no one's control, which was the necessary precondition for it eventually shifting to someone else's. She stayed out of most of it deliberately. What she did was sit in the recovery wing corridor outside Reeves's room, drink another cup of bad vending machine coffee, and be available when people needed to find her. Which they did. Dural twice. Strand once, briefly, looking more tired than he had in the conference room. A woman from the post-judge advocate's office who introduced herself as Captain Briley, and who had the rapid-fire precision of someone who had been woken early and was compensating through sheer efficiency. Briley wanted to walk through the timeline of the previous night. Elara did it with her, from the incident with Owens through the end of the conference room conversation with Strand, in the same flat chronological order she'd used for every briefing she'd ever given in her life. Briley typed notes on a tablet without looking up, occasionally asking clarifying questions that were sharp and specific, and suggested she already understood the tactical context more thoroughly than her JAG designation implied. "The motor pool vehicle," Briley said. "You took it without authorization." "Yes." "You're aware that constitutes unauthorized use of government property?" "Yes." Briley looked up from the tablet for the first time. She had a young face with an old expression, the particular look of someone who had learned early that the law was only as useful as the judgment you applied it with. "I'm not going to pretend that charge is going anywhere given what the vehicle was used for. But Graves' complaint names it, which means it goes into the formal record." She paused. "Everything you did last night goes into the formal record. You understand that?" "I understand." "And you're comfortable with that?" Elara thought about it honestly. Comfortable wasn't exactly the word. She was comfortable with what she'd done. The record of what she'd done was something else. A public document with her name on it, permanent, accessible to people she'd never meet making decisions about her, she'd never know about. "I'm not going to say comfortable," she said, "but I do it the same way." Briley looked at her for a moment, then she went back to the tablet. "Okay," she said, "that's the answer. On." It was Calloway who brought her the first piece of real information at mid-morning, appearing around the corner of the recovery wing, with the contained energy of someone carrying news that was larger than his expression was letting on. "Graves' 2 men," he said, "the ones in the elevator." "Yes." "They're contractors. Private medical consulting firm out of Bozeman, Harwick Associates. They've been providing consulting services to Blackridge under a 6-year contract." He paused. "The contract was initiated and managed exclusively by Graves." She looked at him. "The DIA started pulling the Harwick financials about an hour ago," Calloway said. "They're not talking publicly about what they found yet, but Strand's face when he came out of the file room about 40 minutes ago looked like a man who had found something significantly worse than he was looking for." Elara sat with that. "What kind of consulting firm?" "Medical operations, staffing, process review, efficiency analysis." Calloway's voice was neutral in the specific way he used when the neutrality was doing heavy lifting. The kind of firm that could, theoretically, recommend which staff members were expendable and which processes were inefficient. And if the right person was running it, could ensure those recommendations produce specific outcomes. The shape of it was coming together now, slowly, the way the outline of a landscape emerged from fog. Not all at once, but in pieces that gradually revealed how large the whole thing was. He wasn't just protecting his authority, she said. No, Calloway said. He was protecting a business arrangement. Harwick charges the military medical system for efficiency improvements. The improvements they recommend consistently eliminate experienced senior staff and replace them with cheaper contractors. He paused. Staff who might push back on clinical decisions get flagged as difficult. Staff with specific backgrounds that would give them standing to challenge him, get managed out. She thought about her application, about the flag he'd buried, about the annotated pages Dural had shown her in the conference room, the note in Graves' hand that her background was wholly civilian in nature. He hadn't buried it to protect her from scrutiny. He'd buried it to protect himself from hers. The delayed treatment cases, she said, the 6 documented instances. Strand is looking at the Harwick consulting reports for those same periods, Calloway said, to see if there's a correlation between the recommendations and the treatment decisions. She stood up, walked to the window at the end of the corridor. The parking lot was fully cleared now, the overnight snow pushed into banks at the edges, the surface salted and ordinary and undramatic under a pale noon sky. She thought about Owens on the intake floor with his oxygen reading dropping. She thought about the 2 cases with significantly worse outcomes than they should have had. She thought about 6 years of a man in a neat uniform standing in doorways and making calculations and deciding who was worth the time. She thought about the people who hadn't had someone to go around him. She turned back to Calloway. I need to speak with Strand. Strand was in the administrative wing, in a conference room that had been converted into a working space with a JAG officer on his left and a DIA analyst on his right and 3 laptops open on the table. He looked up when Elara came in. He looked like someone who had not sat down in several hours and was not planning to anytime soon. The Harwick contract, she said. He nodded. Sit down. She sat. We found the first correlation 45 minutes ago, he said. A Harwick efficiency report from 18 months ago that recommended streamlining the trauma intake process, specifically reducing the assessment autonomy of senior nursing staff in favor of a standardized scoring protocol. He paused. 3 months after that report, 2 experienced trauma nurses were flagged for performance issues and reassigned to non-emergency positions. And the treatment timeline cases? Both occurred in the 4-month window after those nurses were reassigned. He looked at her steadily. We're still pulling documentation, but the picture is becoming clear. How clear? Clear enough that the post commander has been briefed, clear enough that Graves has been asked to surrender his command authority, pending the review. He paused. He refused initially. And? Brigadier General Harlow made the request herself, in person. A pause. He didn't refuse twice. Elara looked at the laptops on the table, at the open documents and the pages of annotated records, and the careful, irrefutable architecture of a case that was building itself from 6 years of paperwork that Graves had apparently never believed anyone would look at this closely. There's something else, Strand said. He picked up a single sheet from the table and turned it so she could read it. This was in the folder Graves took from the file room. She looked at it. It was a letter. Official letterhead. Not Blackridge, not Fort Callahan, but a federal medical oversight body she recognized. Dated 8 months ago. Addressed to Colonel Denton Graves, Blackridge Military Medical Center. It was a notification of investigation. Someone had already been looking at Graves 8 months ago. Someone had sent him this letter, officially, formally, through proper channels. And he had filed it in a personnel folder, specifically in hers. She looked up at Strand. He put a federal investigation notice in your personnel file, Strand said. Not his own records. Yours. He paused. We think it was deliberate concealment, burying it in a file he believed was sealed and inaccessible. The notification should have been logged with the post commander's office 8 months ago. But it wasn't. It wasn't. Strand took the letter back, which means the investigation that should have started 8 months ago didn't start. Which means the Bitterroot mission happened under his authority when it should have been under review. He paused. which means Captain Reeves went into that operation under a command structure that was already compromised. The room was very quiet. Outside the conference room's glass partition, the administrative wing moved through its afternoon routines, phones ringing, people passing in the corridor, the low background hum of an institution that was largely unaware of what was happening in this room. Elara watched it through the glass and thought about the specific way catastrophic failures accumulated, not in dramatic moments, but in small, successive decisions that each seemed manageable in isolation and became unmanageable in aggregate. One buried flag. One buried notification. 6 years of managed narratives and reassigned nurses and efficiency reports that moved the pieces without leaving obvious fingerprints, until a captain didn't come back from the mountains. "What happens to Graves?" she said. Strand looked at her. "Formal relief of command is already in process. The JAG investigation will take several months. If the Harwick connection holds, and the preliminary evidence suggests it will, we're looking at charges that go significantly beyond command misconduct." He paused. "His medical authority is suspended effective this morning. His access to the hospital and the installation is being revoked as we speak." She nodded. "Voss," Strand said, "the complaint he filed against you, the nursing board notification, the unauthorized access claims." He put his hands flat on the table. "Given the circumstances under which those records were filed and the evidence of deliberate concealment in your personnel folder, we're recommending that the complaint be dismissed without formal review." He paused. "It's not official yet, but that's where it's going." She looked at him. "And the sealed portion of your service record," she said. "That stays sealed?" "That's not my call, but the people whose call it is have been briefed on this situation, and I don't anticipate any challenge to the sealing arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "You served well. You left cleanly. What you did last night is consistent with everything in that record." A pause. "I don't think anyone is looking to complicate your life any further." She stood up, looked at the table, at the 3 laptops and the pages, and the careful construction of accountability. "The nurses he reassigned," she said. "The ones from 18 months ago. We're locating them," Strand said, "as part of the broader personnel review. Make sure someone talks to them." She picked up her jacket from the chair. "They were doing their jobs. That should be on record too." She left the conference room. Reeves was sitting up when she came back to the recovery bay. Actually sitting, not the careful partial elevation of the post-surgical morning, but properly upright, which was either ahead of schedule or inadvisable depending on who you asked. He had color back in his face, and the IV had been replaced with a saline lock, and he looked like a man who was actively negotiating with his body about the rate of recovery. Calloway was on the phone in the corner, speaking quietly, one hand pressed to his other ear. He glanced at Elara when she came in and held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. Reeves said, "Sit down. Tell me." She sat. She told him. Not everything. The parts that were still in motion, she left in motion. But the shape of it. Harwick, the concealment, the suppressed investigation notice, Graves' suspended authority. Reeves listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He put a federal investigation notice in your file," he said. "Yes." "To hide it." "Yes." He looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of a man processing something that managed to both confirm his worst professional assumptions and still surprise him anyway. 6 years, he said. 6 years. And nobody caught it. Nobody was looking from outside, she said, and he'd managed the inside thoroughly enough that the people who might have caught it were either reassigned or gone. Reeves shook his head slowly, not dramatically. The small, tight movement of someone who found the specific shape of a failure worth noting. "The Bitterroot mission," he said. "My team went in under his medical authority structure." "Yes." "If we'd needed medical support at the extraction—" "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "You can follow that thread later," she said. "Right now it doesn't help anything." He held her gaze. Then, after a moment, "You're right." He leaned back slightly. "Strand told you the complaint is being dropped?" "He said it's where it's going." "It's done," Reeves said with a certainty that was not a guess. "I spoke with Harlow's office an hour ago. They're not going to let a complaint from a man under federal investigation stand against someone who brought a SEAL officer back from the Bitterroot Range." He paused. "That's not sentiment, that's just math." She almost smiled. Almost. Calloway came off the phone. He stood in the center of the room with the particular stillness of someone who had received significant information and was deciding how to present it. "That was the team," he said. "They've been coordinating with the DIA analysts on the Bitterroot Operation Intelligence, the enemy force that conducted the ambush, the contain and capture pattern." He looked at Elara. "Your read was accurate. They confirmed 3 of the fighters were detained at the Canyon Approach Road this morning. They had equipment consistent with a structured capture operation, not a tactical pursuit." He paused. "The intelligence analyst said the pattern ID from the transmission recordings is going into their reference database." He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated expression he'd used in the corridor the previous night, the one that said he'd assessed the situation and was reporting what he found. "They want to know who taught you to read it." "Field experience," she said. "They're going to want more than that." "I know." She looked at her hands. "I'll talk to them." Calloway nodded. He sat down in the chair by the window, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes for approximately 30 seconds, the field nap of someone who had been awake too long and was taking whatever was available. Then he opened them again and looked at the ceiling. "Harwick Associates," he said. "The 2 contractors from the elevator. They're cooperating." Reeves turned. "Already?" Apparently the word federal in front of investigation had an immediate effect on their willingness to have a conversation. Calloway kept looking at the ceiling. "They're providing financial records going back 5 years. The DIA analyst who called me described it as comprehensive. She sounded like she hadn't expected it to be that easy." "Men who build systems designed to survive scrutiny are often surprised when the scrutiny actually arrives," Reeves said. Calloway dropped his eyes from the ceiling. "The post commander is briefing the hospital's entire clinical staff at 1600 hours. Graves' suspension, the review, the personnel actions." He paused. "She asked if you'd be present." He was looking at Elara. She hadn't expected that. She thought about it for a moment, standing in a room of colleagues, some of whom knew her only as the contract nurse who'd been pulled from the floor, being present for the announcement of the things she'd set in motion. "Why?" she said. "She didn't specify," Calloway said. "But my read is she wants the staff to see it, not just hear about Graves. She wants them to see you in the room." He paused. "It matters who's standing where when you make an announcement like that." Elara looked at Reeves. He looked back at her with the quiet patience of a man who had an opinion and had decided to let her reach her own conclusion without it. She looked at the window. The afternoon light had shifted, lower now, the winter sun already pulling toward the horizon at 3 in the afternoon, throwing long shadows across the parking lot. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." The briefing room on the ground floor held about 60 people, and by 3:55 it held all of them. Clinical staff, administrative staff, contract personnel. They came in with the specific anticipatory quiet of a group that knew something significant was happening and hadn't been told exactly what. Elara stood at the back of the room. Calloway was beside her, which she hadn't requested and hadn't needed to. He was simply there, the way he'd been simply there throughout the previous 12 hours, present, steady, without making a production of it. Brigadier General Sylvia Harlow was a compact woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the manner of someone who had spent decades in command positions and had long since stopped performing authority because she didn't need to. She walked to the front of the room without ceremony and looked out at the assembled staff for exactly 3 seconds before she began. She was clear and direct and comprehensive. She covered Graves' suspension, the nature of the review, the involvement of the DIA, and the personnel implications for the hospital's operations going forward. She did not use euphemisms. She did not use administrative language designed to soften the edges of what she was saying. She spoke to them the way people in those chairs deserved to be spoken to, as professionals who could handle the truth. Partway through, she said, "The events that initiated this review began last night, when a member of this hospital's contract staff identified a critical intelligence gap and took independent action that resulted in the recovery of a SEAL officer from the Bitterroot Range." She paused. "That action was taken against explicit instruction from Colonel Graves at personal risk, using resources she accessed without authorization because no authorized resources were made available to her." Another pause. "Her name is Elara Voss. She's standing at the back of the room. I want this staff to know what she did." 60 people turned around. Elara stood there and looked back at them. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She just met the room with the same directness she used for everything. No performance, no deflection. Some of them nodded. Some of them looked at her with the careful, processing expression of people adjusting their mental file. Dr. Fenton, standing in the third row, gave her a small, definite nod and held it for a moment longer than was incidental. Deanna, the intake coordinator from the previous night, was standing near the side wall. She was young, couldn't have been more than 3 years out of school, and she had the wide-eyed, slightly off-balance look of someone who had spent the last 12 hours discovering that the ground she'd been standing on was thinner than she knew. She looked at Elara with the specific expression of a young professional who was recalibrating everything. Harlow continued. She covered the personnel review, the independent clinical oversight being brought in during the transition, the process by which staff concerns about treatment decisions would now be handled. She covered the nurses who had been reassigned. They were going to be contacted, she said, their cases reviewed, their records corrected. When she finished, she answered 4 questions from the floor. Sharp, direct answers, without hedging. Then she looked at the room once more, said thank you, and left the way she'd arrived, without ceremony, at a pace that communicated she had more to do. The room began to move. People drifted toward the doors in the natural dispersal of a group that had been given significant things to think about and needed space to do the thinking. Fenton crossed to Elara at the back. "How's Reeves?" she said. First thing, before anything else. "Better than he should be, probably. He's been arguing with the nurses about ambulating. Don't let him ambulate." Fenton looked at her for a moment with the evaluating directness of a good physician. "Are you all right? You've been awake for—" "I know how long I've been awake. That's not an answer." "I'm all right." She paused. "I will be." Fenton nodded. She started to move away, then stopped. "For what it's worth, that last night with Owens, the way you read the presentation in about 45 seconds. She looked at her. "I've been in emergency medicine for 16 years. I'd have gotten there in 2 minutes, maybe 3. She paused. "What you saw in 45 seconds matters. I just wanted to say that." She left. Elara stood in the emptying briefing room for a moment. The overhead lights hummed. The last of the staff filed through the doors. Calloway was waiting in the hallway outside, visible through the door's narrow window, giving her the room without being asked. Her phone buzzed. Petra. She picked up. "I watched the feed from the briefing," Petra said without preamble. "Harlow did it well." "Yes." "The Harwick records are going to be significant. The preliminary forensic accounting shows payments that don't correspond to documented consulting services. The kind of discrepancy that has a specific legal name." A pause. "Graves is not going to come out of this with a pension." "Good," Elara said. She surprised herself slightly with the directness of it. She'd spent most of the day being measured and clinical about Graves, processing him as a problem to be resolved rather than a man she was angry at. But standing in the empty briefing room in the thin afternoon light, with the fatigue of 30-odd hours pressing at the edges of her awareness, she let herself feel it. The anger, the plain, clean fact of it. "Good," she said again. "Voss," Petra said. Her voice had shifted, moved from operational to something more direct. Personal, almost, though Petra was not a person for whom personal came easily. "There are people in this system who want to talk to you. Not the DIA review, not the JAG investigation. A different conversation." She paused. "About coming back?" Elara said nothing. "You don't have to answer tonight," Petra said, "or this week. But I want you to know the conversation is there if you want it." "I left clean," Elara said. "You left clean. You can come back clean." A pause. "What you did last night, the transmission read, the field response, the decision-making, that's not something that goes away because you traded your field kit for a nursing badge. You know that." Another pause. "The question is what you want to do with it." Elara looked at the empty chairs in the briefing room. At the space where 60 people had been 10 minutes ago, now returned to quiet, and the long late afternoon light coming through the single south-facing window in bars across the floor. She thought about 3 years, about the deliberate quietness she'd tried to build, about Harlow Creek and the third-floor post-op ward, and the careful, smaller version of herself she'd been constructing. She thought about the mountains at night, about the mining track, about the weight of Reeves against her shoulder at the tree line, with 72 hours behind them and everything uncertain ahead. "Let me sleep first," she said. "Of course," Petra said. She ended the call. She stood there another moment, then her phone buzzed again. Different number. Fort Callahan, unfamiliar extension. She looked at it for a moment before picking up. "Voss," said a voice she didn't recognize, male, clipped, with the compressed authority of someone several levels above the conversations she'd been having all day. "This is General Harlow's office. The general would like to see you before you leave the installation today." "I'll be there," she said. She walked toward the door. The phone buzzed a third time before she reached it. A text from a number she recognized as Calloway's. It said, "Reeves wants to see you. Says it's important. Bring the coffee." She looked at it. She almost smiled. She pushed through the door into the corridor, and Calloway fell into step beside her, and they walked together down the corridor toward the recovery wing, and everything felt like it was finally moving in a direction that had gravity behind it, consequence behind it, something real pushing it forward. That was when she saw it. The door to the stairwell at the end of the corridor. The door that should have been closed, that was always closed because it was a fire door on a spring mechanism, was standing open. And Dural was coming through it at a pace that was not his conference room pace. His jacket was pushed back and his hand was at his radio, and his face had the specific stripped-down expression of someone who had stopped managing appearances because something had just happened that made appearances irrelevant. He saw Elara and changed course toward her without breaking stride. "The Harwick contractors," he said. "The ones who were cooperating." She stopped. "The comprehensive financial records they offered," he said. He was close enough now that she could see the tension in his jaw. "Our analyst just finished the first layer review." He looked at her. "There's a payment. A specific payment, 18 months ago, made from a Harwick subsidiary account." He paused. "To a routing number our forensic team traced in about 40 minutes. Calloway said, "Who?" Dural looked at him, then back at Elara. "The routing number belongs to a private consulting account," he said. "Registered in Billings. The account holder has held a position in the Regional Military Medical Oversight Structure for the last 7 years. He took a breath. "The account holder has been sitting in on this morning's review sessions. He's been in this building all day." Elara felt something go very still in the center of her chest. "Who?" she said. Dural said the name. She knew the name. She had seen the name on a door in the administrative wing that morning, had passed it in the corridor twice without registering it as anything other than another piece of the building's ordinary architecture, a name on a door, an office, a position in a structure. A position that would have had access to 6 years of medical records, treatment timelines, staffing decisions, and personnel files. A position that would have had every reason to ensure that what Graves was doing stayed exactly where Graves wanted it. Calloway said very quietly, "He's still in the building." Dural was already reaching for his radio. Dural's radio call went out in the clipped, specific language of someone who had done this before and knew that precision mattered more than speed when you were trying to locate a person inside a building without alerting them. The name he'd said was Weston, Regional Medical Oversight Coordinator, attached to the Northern Montana Military Health Command, a position that sounded administrative because it was designed to sound administrative, that existed at exactly the intersection of authority and invisibility that made it useful to someone who needed both. Weston had been in the building since 8 that morning. He had attended 2 of the review sessions. He had sat across a table from Strand and nodded at the appropriate moments and offered 3 unremarkable observations about process improvement, and nobody had looked at him with anything other than the baseline in attention people extend to someone whose role is familiar and whose face doesn't trigger concern. Elara had walked past his office door twice. She thought about that as Dural worked his radio. The specific texture of not seeing something because the context around it told you there was nothing to see. She had spent 15 years learning to look past context, to read what was actually in front of her rather than what the frame suggested should be there. And she had walked past the door twice. It bothered her in a way she didn't try to talk herself out of. "East stairwell," Calloway said. "I was looking at his phone. One of his operators texting him position updates," she realized, the team she'd stopped noticing because they'd become background. They hadn't become background. "He came down from the 2nd floor 8 minutes ago. Hasn't come back up." "Ground floor exits," Dural said. "My people have the south and west." Calloway was already moving. North is the loading dock. Covered, Dural said into the radio. East exit? A pause on the radio. Then, clear. No contact. Calloway looked at Dural. He's still inside. They moved. The three of them down the corridor at a pace that wasn't running. Running drew attention, drew questions, drew the kind of secondary chaos that made contained situations uncontained. Fast and deliberate and quiet, the way you moved when the goal was resolution rather than confrontation. The ground floor east wing was the maintenance and logistics corridor, the same corridor Elara had used to bring Reeves in the previous night. It ran the length of the building's east side, connecting the loading dock at the north end to the contractor parking access at the south, with supply rooms and equipment storage branching off both sides. It was the part of the building that the clinical staff used without thinking about, and nobody visited on purpose unless they had a reason. Weston had a reason. They found him in the third supply room on the left, standing at a wall-mounted document cabinet with the drawer open and his hands in it. He was a trim man in his late 50s, silver-haired, wearing the kind of civilian business attire that read as professional without being memorable. The deliberate aesthetic of someone who had cultivated unremarkability as a professional asset. He heard them in the doorway and turned. He took in Dural's badge, Calloway's posture, Elara. His face went through several things very quickly, and then it went to the specific stillness of someone who had made a calculation and arrived at a number they didn't like. Agent Dural, he said. His voice was level, impressively level, she thought. Mr. Weston. Dural's voice was not unfriendly. It was the tone of someone who was very sure of where they stood and didn't need to perform it. Step away from the cabinet, please. Weston looked at the open drawer. Then he stepped back. Dural moved to the cabinet. He looked at the contents without touching anything, then looked at Weston. What were you looking for? I have administrative access to these records. I know you do. I'm asking what you were looking for. A pause. Weston looked at Elara. It was a brief look, a flicker of assessment, the kind that lasted less than a second but carried volume. She'd been looked at that way before. It was the look of a man trying to determine how much she knew. She met it without expression. I think, Weston said carefully, that I should speak with a lawyer before this conversation continues. That's your right, Dural said. He was already reaching for his radio. Step into the corridor, please. She didn't watch the formal portion of it. She'd seen enough of those moments to know they were less dramatic in reality than in the telling. A man walking out of a building between two agents while the hallway went briefly, collectively still, and then resumed its normal function. Institutions absorbed these moments faster than people expected. They had to. They were full of people who had work to do. What she did was go back to the recovery wing. Reeves was sitting up in the way he'd been sitting up all afternoon, too upright, not quite against orders, but close to it. He looked at her when she came in and read her face with the attention of someone who had been waiting. Weston, she said. I heard. Calloway's operator came through about 5 minutes ago. He paused. How bad? She sat down. The payment from Harwick's subsidiary account suggests he was on it from the beginning. 6 years, possibly longer. Graves ran the clinical operation. Weston ran the oversight that should have caught it. She looked at her hands. He was the check that was supposed to exist. He made sure it didn't. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Outside the recovery bay window, the late afternoon sky had gone the particular shade of deep blue that precedes full dark in Montana in November. A color that had no warmth in it but had a kind of austere beauty that she'd come to associate with this part of the world and its specific indifference to human difficulty. The 6 cases, Reeves said. The delayed treatments. Yes. The nurses who were reassigned. Yes. This has been running for 6 years, he said. Not a question. The statement of a man placing something in its full context and holding it there long enough to feel the weight. At least, she said. He leaned back, looked at the ceiling. And if you hadn't challenged Graves on Owens last night, he pulls your floor access. You go home, you don't intercept the transmission, I'm declared KIA by morning. Probably. And nobody looks at any of it. Not immediately. She paused. Petra was already looking at Graves, but she was 8 months away from having enough. Weston would have had time to clean the financial trail. He turned his head and looked at her. You know what I keep coming back to? She waited. The intake form, he said. That's where it started. A kid with a dropping oxygen sat and a 2-page intake form. He paused. You could have let it go. Every social calculation in that moment said, let it go. He's the authority, you're the contract nurse. You've been in the position 11 months. You don't have backup. Every calculation said, let it go. Yes, she said. But you picked up the phone. The kid was turning blue, she said. I've never been able to do the math that makes that okay to wait on. Reeves looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. Neither have I. General Harlow's office was on the second floor of Fort Callahan's command building, a 10-minute drive from Blackridge through early evening that had gone fully dark and was working on getting colder. Calloway drove. Elara sat in his passenger seat and watched the frozen landscape go past the window and tried to remember the last time she'd slept. Harlow was standing at the window of her office when Elara came in. Not behind the desk, at the window, looking out at the installation's lit perimeter road, her hands behind her back. She turned when Elara entered. Sit down, she said. It had the same quality her briefing had. Not a performance of authority, just the natural weight of someone who said what she meant. Elara sat. Harlow sat across from her. Not behind the desk. And the chair beside it turned to face her. The configuration of a conversation rather than a briefing. Elara noticed that. Weston is in federal custody, Harlow said. The financial review is ongoing. Based on preliminary findings, he's looking at conspiracy charges in addition to whatever the full investigation produces. She paused. Graves is at JAG right now. His lawyer arrived an hour ago. I heard. The Harwick contract is being terminated effective immediately. Their consulting reports going back 6 years are being reviewed for any clinical impact. She looked at Elara steadily. It's going to be a long process. I want to be honest with you about that. This doesn't get resolved in a week. The board reviews, the personnel corrections, the full accounting of the treatment timeline cases. She paused. But it is going to happen. All of it. The nurses, Elara said. We've located both of them. One is working at a civilian hospital in Billings. One left medicine entirely. Harlow's expression tightened for a fraction of a second. Not much, but enough. I've personally reached out to both. We're going to correct their records, review the performance flags that were filed against them, and if there's a path back to military medicine for either of them, we're going to make that path clear. She paused. That's not a formal commitment. It's a personal one. I want you to know the difference. I know the difference, Elara said. Harlow looked at her for a moment. Strand briefed me on your background. The full picture, not just the nursing credentials. She paused. I've been in this branch for 31 years. I've met a handful of people in that time who have a particular quality, the ability to function at their best exactly when everything around them is at its worst. It's not common. It's not trainable in the conventional sense. She held Elara's gaze. You have it. Elara looked at her hand. She'd been looking at her hands a lot today. The practical habit of someone accustomed to using them for specific work and noting their condition. There was still a faint mark on her right palm from the steering wheel on the mountain track, the grip of 6 hours of difficult driving in bad conditions. Petra spoke with me, Harlow said, about the conversation she had with you this morning. Elara looked up. I'm not here to recruit you, Harlow said. That's not my lane, and I wouldn't do it this way regardless. But I want you to know that what you built here, the nursing credentials, the clinical work, that's not something that needs to be set aside. Whatever you decide about the other conversation. She paused. What you did on that floor with Owens matters. What you did in the mountains matters. They're not separate things. They're the same thing, applied differently. Elara sat with that. My complaint, she said. Graves filing. Dismissed, Harlow said. Formally, as of 2 hours ago. The post-JAG reviewed the circumstances and the context and determined the complaint was filed in bad faith by a party under investigation. She paused. It's not in your record. It won't be. And my access to the communications room. The duty sergeant who let you in has been spoken to. Harlow's expression shifted very slightly. He received a formal notation for the protocol breach. He also received a personal commendation from my office for exercising judgment in a situation where the protocol was inadequate. She paused. Both are on file. Both are accurate. Elara looked at her. Bureaucracies are imperfect instruments, Harlow said, but they're not immovable. If you push the right place at the right time with the right information, they move. She stood. I wanted you to hear that from me, because I think you've spent enough time watching them not move. She stopped at the recovery bay one more time before she left for the night. Reeves was sleeping, actually sleeping, not the deliberate rest of someone managing pain, but genuine sleep, the deep, uncomplicated unconsciousness of a body that had been pushed past its limits and was doing necessary repair. His face in sleep looked younger than it did awake, and less guarded, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him and thought about the mining track in the dark and the tree line and the particular quality of his voice saying, "I'm alone," as both confirmation and question. She didn't wake him. She left a note with the night nurse, specific instructions about the dressing schedule, the pain management rotation, the ambulation timeline that Fenton had ordered and that Reeves was going to try to accelerate. She wrote them in the shorthand she used for handoff notes, precise and numbered, and signed it with her name. She drove home in her own truck. Someone had retrieved it from the hospital parking lot and left it in the Fort Callahan visitor section, which was either Calloway's doing or Harlow's, and she didn't know which, and it didn't matter. She drove the 40 minutes to her apartment in Harlow Creek through the dark and the cold, and she parked in her spot, and she climbed the stairs, and she sat down on her couch without turning on the lights. She sat there for a while. The apartment was quiet. It was the particular quiet of a space that had been empty all day. Not lonely quiet, just empty quiet. The neutral silence of a place waiting for its person to come back. She'd chosen this apartment specifically because it was quiet, because the building was small, and the neighbors were not loud, and the window faced west, and in the evenings, when the sky was clear, you could see the Bitterroot Range as a dark serration against the last light. Tonight the sky was clear. She could see the mountains. She looked at them for a long time, at the range that had been invisible and lethal and full of bad weather 36 hours ago, and was now simply there, dark and permanent and indifferent, the way mountains always were. The mountains didn't care what had happened in them. They had no position on the question of who deserved to come home. They just existed, and you either navigated them or you didn't, and the difference came down to what you knew and what you were willing to do with what you knew. She thought about what Harlow had said. They're not separate things. They're the same thing, applied differently. She thought about 3 years of trying to be quieter, smaller, less visible, building a careful, bounded version of herself that stayed within the lines and didn't cause problems and didn't bring the past forward into the present where it created complications. She thought about Owens, turning blue at the intake counter while a man with a neat uniform talked about paperwork. She thought about the phone, the 45 seconds it had taken to make the call she wasn't authorized to make. She pulled out her phone now. She dialed. Petra picked up on the second ring. "I'm ready to have that conversation," Elara said. A pause. Not surprise. Petra didn't really do surprise. More like the small shift in attention of someone who had been waiting without appearing to wait. "Okay," Petra said. "Tell me what you need." "I need to know what it looks like," Elara said. "Not the program, not the classification level. What it actually looks like, day to day. Whether the nursing credentials stay active. Whether I'm stationed or mobile." She paused. "Whether the work I do here, the clinical work, whether that has a place in it." "Yes to all three," Petra said. "The model has changed since you left. The separation between field and clinical isn't as absolute, especially for someone with your profile. You're not either or. You're both, and both are needed. Who else knows? Right now, me, Strand, Harlow, as of this afternoon." A pause. "Reeves will, when he's recovered enough for that conversation. He's going to want to understand where you land." Elara looked at the mountains. "I'm not making a final decision tonight," she said. "I know, I'm not asking for one." Petra's voice was matter-of-fact. "Sleep. Take a few days. The conversation will still be there." "One more thing," Elara said. "Yes?" "The 2 nurses, the ones Graves reassigned, if there's a path back to military medicine for them, I want to know if there's anything I can do to help clear it." She paused. "Specifically, not generally." A brief silence. "I'll find out," Petra said, "and I'll let you know." "Good," she paused. "Thank you, for 8 months ago, for not pulling me back until it was necessary." "You built something real," Petra said simply. "That matters. It counted." She hung up. She sat in the dark apartment for another few minutes. Then she got up, drank a glass of water, and went to bed. She slept for 11 hours without interruption, which was 4 hours longer than she'd slept in years. The formal proceedings against Graves and Weston began 6 weeks later. The Harwick financial investigation took considerably longer, 3 months of forensic accounting work that eventually produced a 1,200-page report documenting a systematic arrangement between the consulting firm, Graves' clinical decision-making authority, and Weston's oversight role. The report confirmed what the preliminary findings had suggested and went further. 7 years of managed outcomes, 15 staff members affected by manipulated performance reviews, and a billing structure that had redirected government medical funds through 3 subsidiary accounts before arriving at its final destinations. 2 of the delayed treatment cases from Graves' tenure were reclassified by the review board. The patients involved were formally notified. Their files were corrected. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was accurate, and accuracy was where accountability had to start. Graves was formally charged on 11 counts, including criminal conspiracy, fraudulent billing of federal medical services, and 2 counts of negligent command decisions resulting in patient harm. His medical license was suspended within 30 days of the charges being filed. His military retirement was placed under review. Weston, who had spent 48 hours insisting he'd had no knowledge of the financial arrangements, and then spent another 2 weeks watching the forensic accountants build a case that made that position untenable, eventually entered a negotiated plea to federal conspiracy charges. The negotiation did not spare him significantly. He lost his position, his clearances, and faced a sentence that the federal judge, a woman who had read the full Harwick report and had a particular expression on her face throughout the proceedings, described as appropriate to the duration and deliberateness of the arrangement. Neither man walked out of their respective proceedings with the thing they'd valued most: Graves his authority, Weston his invisibility. Both of those things were gone. Captain Nolan Reeves was discharged from Blackridge Military Medical Center on a Thursday afternoon in late December, 41 days after his admission. He walked out under his own power, which he would have done 2 weeks earlier if Fenton had not been extremely firm with him about what post-surgical recovery actually required and what the consequences of ignoring it were. He had tested her firmness twice. She had not moved either time. He found Elara in the parking lot. She was leaning against her truck in the late afternoon cold, hands in the pockets of her jacket, watching the mountains the way she'd been watching them since the night she'd sat in her apartment with the lights off. He walked toward her and she straightened, and they stood for a moment in the parking lot with the pale December light falling flat and clear across the snow. "Fenton says you actually followed the recovery protocol," she said. "I followed most of it." She said most of it. That's nearly a direct quote. The corner of his mouth moved. "How are you?" "Better," she said. And then, because he was looking at her with the attention he used when he wanted a real answer, actually better, not just better than 36 hours ago. She paused. "I made a decision." He waited. "I'm going back in," she said. "Not the same program, different, more integrated." She paused. "Petra's been working on the structure of it. The nursing credentials stay active. That was non-negotiable. The field work and the clinical work run parallel. There are situations where both are needed simultaneously, and right now there's nobody trained for both in the way—" She stopped, simplified. "It's the right fit." Reeves looked at her for a moment. "You sound like you're defending a decision you've already made." "I am." "Then stop defending it." He said it without criticism, just the direct, uncomplicated statement of someone who understood the difference between a decision and an argument. "It's the right call. Anyone who spent 5 minutes watching you work knows it's the right call." She looked at the mountains. "I spent 3 years trying to get small enough that the weight of the past didn't follow me." "Did it work?" "No." "Then it was time to try something else." He paused. "Voss, you came into the mountains for me. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. You went because you were the person who could, and nobody else was going." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a burden. That's who you are. You can carry it standing up or you can carry it bent over, but either way you're carrying it." She looked at him. "Standing up's easier," he said. She almost said something light in response. Then she didn't, because it wasn't a moment for light. "Thank you," she said instead, directly. "For what you said in the recovery bay. About the record. Did it help? Yes. Good. He turned slightly, looking at the parking lot, at the hospital building, at the late afternoon sky going its deep winter blue. Calloway wants to buy you dinner. The team, actually. All of them. Before you go. He said to tell you it's non-negotiable. Tell him I'll think about it. He said you'd say that. He said to tell you the answer is still non-negotiable. She looked at him. Something moved in her chest. Not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of being known by people you hadn't expected to know you. Saturday, she said. Saturday works. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was solid. Not demonstrative, just present. The handshake of someone who meant the thing it represented. Take care of yourself, Voss, he said. You too, she said. Follow Fenton's actual discharge instructions. I'll follow most of them. That's what I'm afraid of. He walked toward the car that Calloway had pulled to the edge of the parking lot, a civilian SUV, Calloway visible behind the wheel, with the same careful patience he'd had in every situation she'd seen him in. Reeves climbed into the passenger seat. The door closed. The car pulled out of the lot and turned toward the highway. She watched it go. The award ceremony was held in January, on a Saturday morning when the sky over Fort Callahan was clear and bright and very cold, with the kind of winter light that made everything look sharp-edged and definite. The installation's main ceremonial hall held about 300 people when it was full. It was full. Elara stood in a preparation room off the main hall in her restored service dress. Not a nurse's uniform, not the civilian clothes she'd lived in for 3 years, but the dress she'd had cleaned and pressed and retrieved from the back of a storage closet 2 weeks earlier when Strand had called to tell her what Harlow had proposed. She'd looked at it for a long time before she put it on. She didn't feel transformed by it. She felt like herself, which was different, not the version of herself that had been working backward from a past she'd tried to set aside, but the version that had stopped pretending the past and the present were separate countries. They were the same country. She had always been living there. She had just spent 3 years telling herself otherwise. The ceremony was not the thing she would remember most about that morning. She would remember Harlow's voice reading the commendation, specific, detailed, giving the actual facts of what had happened in the Bitterroot Range and in the hospital building afterward, without euphemism or inflation, which was somehow more affecting than decoration would have been. She would remember Calloway's face in the front row, the same contained expression he used for everything, except that around the eyes it wasn't quite contained, and he didn't try particularly hard to make it so. She would remember the 2 nurses. One of them, Serena Muir, the one who'd left medicine entirely, who'd been working a logistics management job in Billings for 2 years, was there at Elara's specific request, which Harlow had facilitated. She was a woman in her early 40s, who had the particular look of someone who had made a separate peace with something and was now being asked to revisit it. Elara had spoken with her twice on the phone in the preceding weeks. She hadn't tried to persuade her of anything. She'd just talked about what had been found, what the records showed, what the board review had determined about the performance flags that had ended Serena's military career. Serena had listened without saying much on either call. On the second call, at the end, she'd said, I thought it was me. For 2 years I thought it was me. She came to the ceremony. She sat in the second row. When Elara walked off the stage with the commendation in her hands, she went to Serena before she went anywhere else. They stood in the aisle between the chairs while the ceremony continued, and Elara said, Your records have been corrected, formally, permanently. The performance notations are gone. If you want to come back, the path is open. She paused. If you don't, I understand that too. But I wanted you to hear it from someone who was standing in that building when they figured out what was done to you. Serena looked at her. She was not a woman who showed things easily. She had the carefully managed exterior of someone who had learned to absorb blows without letting the impact show. But something in her face, looking at Elara in the aisle of the ceremonial hall, shifted. Thank you, she said. She said it the way people said it when they meant something larger than the words. Elara nodded. Then Reeves was there, because Reeves was always going to find the moment when the formal event ended and the real one began. He was moving carefully, the considered gait of someone 6 weeks out of major surgery who was being measured about the ambulation. And he had Calloway on one side of him in the preventive way of a team sergeant who had decided that looking like he wasn't helping was a reasonable strategy for not being told to stop. Reeves stopped in front of her. He looked at the service dress, at the commendation she was holding, at her face. Then he came to attention and saluted. It was not a casual salute. It was full and sharp and held, the kind that said something precise about what the person giving it thought of the person receiving it. From behind him, one by one, the team followed. 6 men coming to attention in the aisle of the ceremonial hall, holding their salutes with the same precision and the same held quality, in front of a woman who had driven into the mountains for a man they loved and brought him home. She stood straight. She returned the salute. Her hand was steady. 3 weeks later, on a morning in late January, when Harlow Creek was so cold that the air hurt to breathe, Elara Voss packed what she needed into the back of her F-250. Not much, because she had learned a long time ago that the things you actually needed were fewer than the things you thought you needed, and drove north toward the regional staging facility where Petra's team was expecting her. The nursing credentials were in her bag. Active, current, transferred to a new institutional affiliation that looked civilian on its surface and was not civilian underneath. The service dress was folded in a separate case in the cab. She was not going to need it today. She might need it later, and when she did, it would be there. The Bitterroot Range was visible in the east as she drove, white and immense and lit by the low morning sun, the peaks sharp against a sky that was as blue and definite as anything she'd seen. She'd driven past those mountains 100 times in 11 months without looking at them the way she looked at them now. They were not the same mountains they'd been 6 weeks ago. Or maybe they were exactly the same and she was different, which amounted to the same thing. She thought about the moments it had come down to. Not the big ones, not the surgical bay or the ceremonial hall or the conversation with Harlow, the small ones. The 45 seconds it took to pick up the phone, the 8 steps across a corridor toward a young soldier turning blue at the edges. The decision to drive around a barricade in a blizzard because the information she had and the capabilities she had and the empty road ahead of her created an obligation she couldn't argue herself out of. People talked about courage as if it was a quality you either had or didn't, a fixed attribute, like eye color. She'd learned it was more like a muscle. You used it in the small moments or you didn't, and if you didn't, it was smaller the next time you needed it. You used it in the small moments, and it was there for the large ones. And the cost of not using it was always paid by someone else. That was what Graves had never understood, what people like Graves never understood, the ones who built their authority on the managed smallness of the people around them. They thought the risk was theirs when they stood in doorways and made calculations. But the risk was never theirs. It was always Owen's at the counter with his oxygen dropping, or the nurses quietly reassigned, or the captain in the mountains that nobody came back for. The people who absorbed the cost of someone else's calculation were never in the room when the calculation was made. Elara had been in enough rooms by now. She'd made her decision about whose math she was willing to be part of. She drove north as the sun climbed. The mountains fell behind her and then curved around to the west, always visible, always there. The road was clear and long, and the truck ran well despite its miles, and the heater was working this morning without complaint. She thought about Reeves' words. That's who you are. You can carry it standing up or bent over, but either way you're carrying it. She was standing up. She had been, maybe, for longer than she knew. She'd just needed the mountains and a broken latch and a transmission that lasted 11 seconds to remind her. The road stretched out ahead, straight and definite, and without an end she could see from here. She drove toward it.